Hey YouTube, recently I built this tool well for this Harbor Freight Workbench, and I've been pretty happy with it. During the making, however, I came across some problems. I tried to use the bench dogs that come with the Harbor Freight Workbench to do some clamping or surface clamping. This didn't work out very well, needless to say. In another video, I used a Harbor Freight wood clamp and a homemade jig to substitute for a front-facing vise on the Harbor Freight Workbench, as the workbench only comes with a tail vise, which can be inconvenient to access sometimes. But I'm still left with the challenge of how do I hold things on the surface of my workbench. And I thought about remaking some of the bench dogs, but then I came across a really interesting video on YouTube by Rex Kreuger, and if you haven't subscribed to his YouTube channel, I highly recommend it. Rex Kreuger demonstrated a plastic vise, something called a Meyer-Vise, which seemed to work very well for holding things on the surface of a bench. It's a fairly simple system. It comes with a fence, which is rectangular, and these spiral sort of knobs, which are the actual vise mechanism. And I thought, well, maybe I can make one for the Harbor Freight Workbench. So the first thing I always do is I try to prototype it using sort of inexpensive scrap wood. And I had to make those round sort of clamping vices. I used a simple sort of masking tape circle. And then I drew a larger circle, twice the circumference around that. And then connected the circles into sort of that sort of spiral shape that is used in the vise. I next took a 3/4 inch dowel, which I got from Home Depot, and cut it down. Then I put a hole in the center of my spiral, and this sort of jig will fit perfectly into the existing bench dog holes on the Harbor Freight Workbench. Now some of the holes are smaller than others, and so you may want to sort of sand the holes to make them bigger, or you can sand the dowels to make them smaller. But overall, it's a pretty close fit for most of the holes on the bench. I then tried to test it, using the spiral to push a board against one of the bench dogs that comes with the Harbor Freight Workbench, and it didn't seem to work very well. I thought it might be because I'm only using a single spiral, so I actually made a second spiral the same way with a mirror image, left and right. And when I tried the two spirals together to lock a board, it still didn't seem to hold the board in place very well at all. So it must be because my spirals were actually just circles that look like spirals. In a true spiral, there would be a gradual increase in the diameter as the spiral moved out. And mine was actually just a large circle to make it look like a spiral. So I needed to figure out a way to draw a spiral or make a spiral with a gradual increase in the diameter or circumference. And I looked at a lot of videos and some YouTube videos on how to draw a spiral, but then it dawned on me, why don't I just print out a picture of the Meyer-Vise that's available on the internet and use it as a template? And this seemed to be the best way to draw a gradually increasing spiral. You can see here my previous prototype compared to sort of the drawing of a Meyer-Vise that I got from the internet. So from here, it was just a matter of cutting out my template, and then gluing my templates to a piece of scrap plywood, and then cutting my new spirals for my Meyer-Vise, which I did outside of my garage, off screen, to avoid the sawdust collection indoors. So using a cutout picture from the internet is actually convenient because it also tells you exactly where to put the holes in for the dowels, which are also off-center a little bit, increasing the ability for the spiral to increase in circumference as you turn it to give you clamping force. So I just drilled some pilot holes here, and then I'll follow it up with a spade bit to make a hole big enough for my dowels to go in, and those will eventually fit into the workbench dog holes. I now have my new spirals, which I now put in my dowels, and then they can go into the workbench holes, and we can now give them a try. You can now see these version 2.0 templates with the picture still on them. Label them left and right. And here they are compared to version 1.0. It's kind of hard to say or tell, but version 1 is actually more of a circle. In version 2, you can see that the fulcrum point or the dowel insertion is actually a little bit off center as well. So I think it's important to use this template or picture from the internet. They insert into the dog holes, and then they can spin to add clamping pressure. Here you can see one of the holes was a little small for the spiral dowel, and so I just took a wood rasp and sort of tried to increase the size of the hole. There were only occasional holes that were too small on the workbench, but in the end what I ended up doing was actually sanding the dowel down to decrease the diameter so it will more easily fit into all the workbench holes. And now we're ready to test version 2.0 of my prototype. Here you can see the spirals actually decrease the distance between them as you turn them. And so as you turn these in, you actually can hold the board in place. Now, one of the things I noticed is that the spirals were not perfectly symmetrical. And because of that, when you use the two spirals to try to clamp in between each other, you got some of the board shifting. In other words, it wasn't sort of straight on my bench because the surfaces weren't meeting particularly straightforward. And I would fix that in version 3.0. However, when you use version 2.0 of these spirals to clamp something against the fence or hold it against a fence, or in this case, two workbench dogs that come with the Harbor Freight workbench, it seems to work very well. And so I was really happy with this new spiral design. Comparing it to my version 1.0, where you get almost no clamping force at all. As I mentioned earlier, one of the problems with my spirals is the left and right versions were not actually perfectly symmetrical to each other or mirror images of each other. You can see there's a little extra material on one of them compared to the others. And then this leads to asymmetrical clamping pressure when you're trying to use them to clamp against each other. And so in my version 3.0, we'll fix that. Now, one of the important things is to understand how much movement there is in the vise. You can see here at its furthest point, it's 4.5 inches from the bench dog, and at the closest point, it's 3 inches, so it has about 1.5 inches of movement. So for version 3.0, I'm going to use this old trick where you just put some masking tape in between two pieces of plywood, and then you use cyanoacrylate or super glue to put the boards together. And then I'm going to use one template, again a picture from the internet. I used a slightly larger one this time, I just blew it up. And then I'm going to cut out both pieces at the same time with the jigsaw so that they'll be perfectly symmetrical or mirror images of each other. And here you can see my new spirals. They're two spirals glued together, held together by masking tape, sanded them down, and although not perfect, they're much better sort of replicants or mirror images of each other, so I'll get more symmetrical clamping pressure when I use them. And finally, inserting my dowels into my version 3.0. One other modification I made to this version 3.0 was that you can see the tails don't end in a point. I sort of kept the tail sort of square on my spirals, and I thought that would actually be stronger. I was afraid that the pointy tails might break as I use them, and so the square tails of the spirals make them a little bit stronger. I also used slightly shorter dowels this time. They're probably about 1.5 inches long, and that seemed to be plenty to go into the dowel holes and also give good force pressure as you spiral them out. And now here we're testing them against each other. I'm using the spirals to clamp a board. It seems to hold very well, at least in one direction. It's still not perfect in terms of symmetry, so the board was a little bit crooked on my bench. Next, I would use the spirals and some bench dogs as my fence again to hold a board. Now you can see here, as I put in this pallet board against my regular workbench dogs that come with the bench, and I spiral it in, that's actually in there very well. And so this version 3.0 seems to be working very well, and the wood is actually held very tightly by this. You can actually pound the spirals in tighter if you want to, but I found using my hands is probably plenty of clamping pressure, and I actually have to sort of pound them out sometimes to get them undone. Here I'm just sort of moving it down the workbench into different holes so I can have a wider board clamped. Now, one of the limitations of using the workbench dog you can see here is the size of the board you can clamp is actually limited. So the traditional Meyer-Vise that's Rex Kreuger sort of demonstrated had a fence that would actually move or was adjustable. Now, one of the neat things about these Meyer-Vises is you actually use more than two spirals to clamp pieces of wood together. Here I'm actually using 3 of the spirals to clamp a piece. And there are pictures on the internet where you can use actually multiple spirals to clamp things to the surface of your bench of different shapes and sizes. So the one thing I wanted to figure out was how far or how much sort of movement there was between my clamp from the fully open position to the fully closed position. So I used a piece of masking tape and tried to figure out how far there was in the travel of the spiral. So confirming the distance, it's about 1.5 inches for the maximum travel of the vise. I noticed this video is getting kind of long, so I think I'll take a break here and have a part 2. In part 2, I'll talk about how I made the fence. You can see it here. So if you'd like to see the video on how to make the fence, please subscribe. Otherwise, I'll have it posted in about a week after I'm done editing it. Thanks everyone. See you soon.